When you talk about this day in history, September 11th is particularly poignant in the United States. It's a date that is etched in the national consciousness, one of those where were you when it happened sort of days. As a historian, it's a daunting task to even talk about September 11th. There's no singular way to memorialize those events. Even trying to grasp the context seems like just a monumental task. But events like September 11th do make some things clear, and 9/11 made one thing very clear to this nation, and that is the debt of gratitude that we owe to our nation's first responders, those people who risk their lives to protect the lives of others, who, as they say, run towards disaster rather than away from it. You know, the context of those professions is still too much for what we do in a channel this size, but we can do a start by talking about the often forgotten and sometimes misunderstood history of the profession of firefighting. It's history that deserves to be remembered. The genesis of public firefighting goes back at least to antiquity. In 22 BC, Emperor Augustus created a corps of men, slaves, under the supervision of magistrates, responsible for checking and preventing fires. Fire was a constant threat in ancient cities, even more so than today, and there were at least 100 common fires in ancient Rome every day. In at least the 1st century BC, wealthy Romans started funding their own fire brigades. Such men often did so with political ambitions, currying favor with the citizens by putting out fires. Partly because he saw such men as a political threat, and partly because of devastation due to damage from fires and floods, Augustus created a formal system of firefighting around 6 AD. The system had divisions of firefighters, most commonly made up of freedmen, slaves that had earned their freedom, called vigils, meaning watchmen. Each division would be responsible for firefighting and prevention in 2 of the city's districts, and would operate from fire stations, called excubatorium. Firefighting was mostly done with buckets, although Romans did use a type of hydraulic hand pump. Axes and ropes with hooks were used to pull down houses that were burning or in the path of the fire to create a fire break. This raises the interesting question of why these brigades failed to stop the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. While there are multiple and conflicting descriptions of the fire, some claiming that the fire was started and encouraged deliberately, it is likely that the strong wind blowing the fire into blocks of wooden houses simply made a fire too large to fight with existing tools. However, after burning for 6 days, the fire was eventually stopped by using a massive fire break at the Esquiline Hill made of stone rubble and building materials. The break would have required a massive and cooperative effort, and demonstrates that the Romans were using sophisticated firefighting knowledge and techniques. We can surmise that every ancient civilization faced the constant risk of fire, and that all of them had some sort of response, even if those haven't been documented. The profession of firefighting, people trained in the use of the tools and techniques for fighting fires, is at least as old as civilization. King's watches, watchmen responsible for watching both for crime and for fire, were common in the medieval period. These watchmen could catch fires in their early stages, warning people. Fire was quite common. Buildings were usually made of wood and often had thatched roofs, and of course, fire was the only means of lighting, cooking, and heating. Major cities regularly experienced large fires. Eventually, fire codes started to become established and enforced. London created a set of building codes to address nuisances, including sanitation complaints and fire hazards, near the end of the 12th century. Henry Fitzelwin, the first mayor of the City of London, banned the use of thatched roofs in 1212, following a major fire in the city. But London had no official municipal fire brigade, and firefighting techniques were a little more sophisticated than they had been in ancient Rome. The city faced a number of great fires, notably the Great Fire of 1666. Very like the Great Fire of Rome, strong winds and wooden construction simply exceeded the ability to fight the fire with buckets and hand pumps. In the end, though, it was a newer technology that was used to extinguish the Great Fire. Under the direction of Naval Administrator Samuel Pepys, the Navy used gunpowder to clear sections of the city in front of the fire. The Great Fire of 1666 burned nearly 80% of the City of London, but that allowed the opportunity to rebuild with much stricter building codes, and led to the establishment of the very first professional fire brigades in London. But these were not municipal brigades, but fire brigades created and maintained by insurance companies. If a business or homeowner bought the insurance, their house would get a plaque. If there was a fire, the insurance brigades would check for the plaque and only fight the fire if the property was insured with their company. Firefighting technology got a boost in 1672 when Dutch painter, draftsman, and inventor Jan van der Heijden invented a flexible leather hose with brass fittings. Van der Heijden also pioneered hand-pumped fire engines to use with the hose. English inventor Richard Newsham took out two patents, the first in 1721 and the second in 1725, for his design of a new water engine for quenching and extinguishing fires. The engine used two pistons driven by people pushing long handles, and the largest engine could pump 200 U.S. gallons of water a minute. Unlike the earlier fire engines, which delivered water in erratic squirts, Newsham's engine provided a continuous stream of water up to a distance of more than 150 feet. The fire engines were long and narrow, allowing them to pass through an ordinary doorway, and were available in 6 sizes. The City of London used Newsham fire engines until 1832. In the colonies, the City of Philadelphia ordered 2 Newsham engines in 1730, as did New York City a year later. In 1784, Englishman Daniel Messeries invented a machine called a fire escape, which, being fastened to the window, would enable a person to descend to the street without injury. English inventor George William Manby invented the first modern fire extinguisher, which he called the extincteur in 1813. The device used potassium carbonate and compressed air. What some describe as the first municipal fire brigade was formed in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1824, led by a man named James Braidwood. Then in 1830, Edinburgh established the first modern standards for the operation of a fire brigade. In 1832, Braidwood was persuaded to move to London to lead a force of professional firemen called the London Fire Engine Establishment. Braidwood demonstrated the dedication and sacrifice of his profession, when on June 22, 1861, he died in the Tooley Street fire at Cotton's Wharf near London Bridge Station, crushed by a falling wall. His funeral procession stretched 1.5 miles. Braidwood has been described as the father of the British Fire Service. Braidwood's brigade was still privately funded by insurance companies, and partly as a result of the Tooley Street fire. In 1865, Parliament passed the Metropolitan Fire Brigade Act, creating the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, now known as the London Fire Brigade. The first fire regulation in America was established after a major fire in Boston in 1631. In 1648, in New Amsterdam, now New York, an organization officially known as the Prowlers, but given the nickname the Rattle Watch, consisting of 8 wardens which were drawn from the male population, was established. Fire equipment such as hooks, ladders, and buckets were financed through the collection of fines for dirty chimneys. Patrolling the streets with buckets, ladders, and hooks from 9 in the evening until dawn, they would go looking for fires. These wardens were the beginnings of the first public fire department in North America. Fire played a role in the founding of Williamsburg as the colonial capital of Virginia. The first documented structural fire in America had occurred at the Jamestown colony on January 7, 1608. It was so bad that it was reported to have destroyed all the houses in the fort. The first buildings in the fort had barely been completed when a stray spark set afire to one of the houses and spread so that, apart from 3 dwellings, the entire settlement was burnt to the ground. The problem of fire prevention in the colony persisted. There were 4 different state houses built in Jamestown to house the Virginia legislature, and all 4 of them burned to the ground. The last one, in October of 1698, was probably the result of arson, possibly set by a prisoner who had been sentenced to death by execution and so had nothing to lose. And the legislature, after this 4th disaster, used that as an excuse to abandon low-lying Jamestown and move to the healthier and more easily defended inland location of Williamsburg. The new Capitol building in Williamsburg burned to the ground in 1747, and when a nearby fire threatened the newly rebuilt Capitol in 1754, the Virginia Council purchased a fire engine, probably a hand pump, and 4 dozen leather buckets from London. In 1756, the town acquired a new fire engine, which, although the records are lost, was probably a Newsham engine. In 1788, the Virginia legislature had a new Capitol building, this time in Richmond, where they passed an act to authorize the establishment of fire companies. The act made it lawful for residents of a town to form firefighting groups whose members agreed to be responsible for obtaining equipment, learning how to use it, drilling regularly, and extinguishing any fires that broke out. Although the first homeowners insurance company in the United States was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1754, that actually wasn't commonly used in the United States till around 1800, and so the United States didn't develop those insurance company fire brigades like they did in London. Americans developed their own tradition of fighting fires as a grassroots collective using bucket brigades. If there was a fire, neighbors would run to help. People would toss buckets into the street for volunteers to fill with water and pass forward to be dumped on the fire. Many communities required the keeping of buckets, which would be kept handy in a front hall, and have a name and an address on them so that they could be collected later. It became such a matter of civic pride that some families would have their buckets ornately painted. New York City's first firehouse was built in 1736 in front of City Hall on Broad Street. The General Assembly then created a volunteer fire department in 1737, appointing 30 men who would remain on call in exchange for exemption from jury and militia duty. The city's first official firemen were required to be able, discreet, sober men who should be known as firemen of the city of New York, and be ready for service by night and by day, and be diligent, industrious, and vigilant. Volunteer fire departments are still quite common in the United States, where more than 2/3 of the nation's firefighters are volunteers. These early volunteers, young men who were strong enough to pull the engines, have earned a reputation of being unruly and unprofessional. But Timothy Winkle of the Smithsonian Institution noted in Smithsonian Magazine in 2016 that these were not amateurs, but as trained as the technology of the time allowed. While there are stories about the rowdies fighting in the streets rather than fighting fires, in fact that likely represents a tiny, if more dramatic, representation of firefighting in the 18th and 19th centuries. As today, these volunteers were dedicated members of the community who risked their own lives and safety to protect the lives and property of their community. Prior to the 19th century, firemen would access municipal water to fight a fire by digging down to the city water main, which was usually made of wood, and punching a hole in it. After the fire, the hole would be blocked with what was called a fire plug. The first cast iron stand-up fire hydrant was patented in 1801, most likely by a man named Frederick Graff. Ironically, we don't know that that attribution is correct, as the original patent application was lost when the U.S. Patent Office and its contents were destroyed by a fire in 1836. As buildings grew taller, hand-powered pumps were not able to reach upper floors, and stronger steam-powered pumps were needed. Those types of pumps required fewer but better-trained firefighters to operate. In 1853, Cincinnati, Ohio became the first city in the United States with a fully paid fire department. Shrinking the sizes of fire companies and replacing volunteers with paid departments was somewhat of a social problem in the United States. Volunteer fire companies existed to do more than just fight fires, but were important social organizations. Another change came with the invention of the internal combustion engine. The New York City Fire Department had consolidated in 1865 and replaced its volunteers with paid professionals. Regulations were strengthened and discipline and structure created along military lines. In 1870, a system was devised to base promotion on merit. The fire department of the city of New York received its first piece of motorized fire apparatus in 1909. The terrible fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company killed 146 workers, most of whom were young female immigrants, on March 25, 1911. The tragedy helped to spur the creation during the same year of a fire college to train new firefighters, and a Bureau of Fire Prevention was created in 1912. And it was that fire department of New York that responded on September 11, 2001. The fire department of New York deployed 121 engine companies, 62 trunk companies, 5 rescue companies, 6 squad companies, 27 chief officers, and more than 1,000 firefighters, EMTs, and paramedics on the scene when the towers collapsed. 343 Fire Department of New York firefighters who responded to the attacks lost their lives in the building's collapse. Hundreds more suffer a variety of long-term health effects as a result of their heroism that day. Today, the largest fire department in the world is the Tokyo Fire Department, which has some 18,000 permanent employees and more than 26,000 volunteers, has a budget of more than 2.3 billion US dollars, and has more than 1,900 pieces of fire apparatus. There's no clear record on the total number of firefighters in the world today, but in the United States alone there are 1.1 million firefighters, about a third of whom are paid and the rest are volunteers, although in terms of training and ability the volunteers are no less professional. And while better building codes and fire prevention have reduced the structural fires in the United States, still, according to the U.S. Fire Administration, 64 firefighters in the United States lost their lives in the line of duty in 2018. And as of the making of this episode, so far 33 have lost their lives in 2019. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.